47 senators rolled their eyes when J.D. Vance stood at that podium. They expected numbers, policy, the usual chessboard of Washington. Instead, he said a name. A football player. Whispers turned to smirks. The cameras zoomed in, waiting for him to correct himself. But he didn't. He doubled down. This man is a cornerstone, not just for his team, but for a country that's forgotten how to recognize quiet strength. Within 24 hours, that same name was trending across America. And within 48, a hidden act of compassion, buried for years, would bring Capitol Hill to silence. This isn't just a story about politics. It isn't even just about football. It's about recognition, the kind that arrives late, often silent, but always earned. And while the scenes that follow are dramatized, inspired by public figures and the values they stand for, they were crafted with care to reflect something deeper. The truth that some of the most important stories aren't headlines. They're moments, quiet ones. The kind we carry, not because they're factual, but because they feel honest. So no, not every word you'll hear next happened exactly this way. But the feelings, the courage, the question of what kind of country we become when we choose to see the invisible, that part is real. So ask yourself, what kind of man forces Congress to sit down, shut up, and listen? Not with power, but with principle? Tay with us. It's not just a story, it's a reminder of what still matters. They say Washington has a rhythm. Reporters know when to lean in, when to glaze over, when to check their phones. That Tuesday afternoon, they didn't expect anything new. The schedule read, Senator Vance, comments on budget reconciliation, Bill 48B, a mouthful, and for most of the Capitol press corps, a cue to prep softball questions or mentally check out. Then J.D. Vance walked in, alone. No staff, no folder, no teleprompter. Just a legal pad, half crumpled, held like a pocket Bible. The cameras clicked lazily. Lights buzzed overhead. Someone in the back whispered, 3 minutes, Max. J.D. approached the podium slowly, deliberately. He adjusted the mic with a faint screech that made heads lift, not out of curiosity, but instinct. Another senator about to drone on about fiscal responsibility and middle-class relief. Another face in a Navy suit. Then he cleared his throat and threw every expectation off script. This isn't about tax brackets today, he said, his voice calm, but cutting through the murmurs. It's about someone who deserves something more than applause. A contract. A beat. Confused glances. He continued. Today, I want to talk about Trey Hendrickson. The room froze. Trey Hendrickson, the football player, Bengals, defensive end. One reporter actually laughed under his breath. Another began typing, J.D. Vance goes off script with sports sermon, assuming this was some clumsy metaphor tying sacks to Senate bills. But J.D. wasn't smiling. His eyes scanned the room, heavy and unreadable. Not because he scored touchdowns. He didn't. He stopped others from scoring them, quietly, consistently, relentlessly. You probably don't know his stats. That's fine. I'm not here to sell jerseys. I'm here to remind you who holds the line. Now the energy shifted. Several journalists straightened up. One lowered her phone. Another leaned forward, unsure if this was a stunt or the start of something deeper. In a town that worships visibility, we've forgotten the value of the invisible. The ones who don't celebrate when the job's done, but only when it's done right. This wasn't campaign fluff. There was a tightness in JD's voice, a restraint, like he was standing on the edge of saying something not meant to be said here, at this mic, in this room, and that made people listen harder. In the second row, a political columnist tapped his colleague. Is this about a bill? I don't think so, she replied. I think this is about a man. JD went on. He spoke of leadership that doesn't chase headlines, of locker rooms where humility leads louder than ego, of how sometimes the people worth honoring are the ones we never thought to nominate. Trey Hendrickson has earned his contract extension, not because he sells out stadiums, but because he shows up when no one's watching. And then he stopped. No applause, no slogan, just silence. It wasn't awkward. It was loaded. Everyone expected numbers. Instead, they got a name. A single name, dropped like a stone in still water, causing ripples that no one saw coming. Outside the frame, JD's press secretary stood frozen. This speech hadn't been on the schedule, not even in the drafts. It was off message, off topic, off everything, and yet something about it felt on time. As JD stepped back from the microphone, a reporter finally spoke. "Senator Vance, are you endorsing a football contract?" From the Senate podium? JD paused at the edge of the stage, looked over his shoulder. "No," he said quietly. "I'm endorsing a value this place forgot." He didn't wait for follow-up questions. He walked out, leaving behind a room no longer bored, just baffled, and maybe for the first time in weeks, curious. By the time JD Vance stepped into the back hallway, his phone was already vibrating nonstop. Mentions, mentions, mentions. "Is this an NFL ad? Wrong mic, wrong room, wrong message. Stick to the budget, Senator. Who the hell is Trey Hendrickson?" It didn't take long for the first op-ed to appear. "Senator Vance uses Senate podium to pitch player contract. Where's the line?" Cable news had a field day. Clips of JD's speech ran split screen with ESPN footage. One anchor joked, "Next week, maybe he'll recommend who should be traded from the Yankees." Laughter all around. But inside JD's office on Capitol Hill, no one was laughing. His lead communications advisor, Paige Whitmore, sharp and loyal but pragmatic to a fault, shut the door behind her and tossed a printed news alert on his desk. "You just gave the entire budget reconciliation narrative to Fox Sports." JD glanced at the headline, didn't say a word. Another aide chimed in, clearly agitated. "Sir, with respect, this isn't polling well. People think you're unserious. You're trending alongside Travis Kelce and Diet Coke memes." Paige folded her arms. "We have 3 committee appearances next week, and now every question's going to be about a football player, not inflation, not healthcare." Trey Hendrickson JD leaned back slowly, gaze fixed on the news alert like it might blink back at him. Then he looked up and said calmly, "Good. Let them ask." The room fell quiet. Because maybe the people outside this building don't want more graphs. Maybe they want proof that commitment still matters, that somebody still shows up without needing to be told they're heroic. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Capitol dome loomed, immense, unmoving, but slightly blurred behind glass smudged with fingerprints. We keep telling Americans to trust the system, but the system doesn't trust them. And when they see a man like Trey, someone who's earned respect without demanding attention, they remember what real leadership looks like. There was no anger in his voice, no defensiveness, just clarity, the kind that unnerves people used to strategy over sincerity. Paige softened. "But why now? Why from the Senate floor?" JD turned back, slower this time. "Because if I'd said it anywhere else, no one would have listened." The room didn't argue further. They didn't agree either. They simply paused, each silently weighing the risk of losing political momentum against the rare weight of a moment that felt real. And outside on Twitter, a high school civics teacher in Cincinnati shared the clip with a quiet caption. "I played this for my students today. One of them asked, 'Why does no one talk like this anymore?'" The post barely cracked a few hundred likes, but JD saw it. Later that night, long after the news cycle had moved on to flashier headlines, he screenshotted it and saved it in a folder named Cornerstones. He didn't say it aloud, but it was there in how he closed his laptop, sat in silence, and let the noise pass like a storm he'd expected all along. And somewhere beneath that storm, a quiet question began to take shape. What happens when a senator uses power not to command attention, but to direct it? The headlines would fade by morning. That much JD knew. There would be new bills, new scandals, new sound bites that swallowed the day like waves over footprints. But tonight, the noise outside his office walls couldn't penetrate the silence inside. He sat alone, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, one hand resting on a remote, the other scribbling in a notebook already half filled with underlined fragments and questions no one ever asked out loud. On his laptop, Trey Hendrickson played without speaking a single word. No touchdowns, no end zone dances, just sacks, pressure, breakdowns, blocks that bought his team 2 more seconds, hits that didn't make highlight reels but made the difference between a win and a collapse. JD didn't look for style. He looked for structure, the hidden architecture of every defensive play. How Trey didn't chase glory, he plugged gaps. How he didn't celebrate individual victories, he pointed at teammates instead. Click, next clip, fourth quarter, Bengals down 6. The offense frustrated, the stadium anxious. Trey doesn't flinch. He explodes off the line, sheds a block, forces a hurried throw. Incomplete. Third down, click. New game. Trey's not even in the frame at first. Then he appears, pushing another player up from the turf. Rookie lineman, shaking his head, mouthing, "You got it next time." JD scribbled, "We cheer for offense, but we survive because of defense." He paused, looked at that sentence, drew a box around it, then shaded it in. He leaned back, let the room settle, let the glow of the screen dim and wash across the ceiling like distant headlights on an empty highway. It reminded him of home, of the men he'd grown up around. Tough, weathered, invisible unless something broke and they fixed it. The ones who didn't ask for applause because they were too busy holding things together. He thought about his uncle, the steel mill, the way no one remembered his name, but everyone remembered when he didn't show up for a shift because the entire line stalled. Trey reminded him of that, of men who don't raise their voice to be heard because they never stop speaking through what they did. JD turned off the video, sat in the dark, thought not about strategy or headlines or the political calculus of it all. He thought about silence and how some men earn their power in it. Then he reached for his phone, scrolled past a few missed calls, found the number he'd saved but never used, Cincinnati Bengals front office. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't ask for permission. The line rang once, twice, a quiet click. "Yes?" a voice answered. JD exhaled, calm and clear. "This is Senator Vance. I don't want to take up much of your time, but I just watched 3 hours of tape, and I think you already know this, but in case the noise makes you forget, Trey Hendrickson is not replaceable." A pause, not out of disagreement, but surprise. "And if you're thinking about value, don't look at contracts. Look at the moments when the stadium's on edge and the scoreboard's tight. Look at who's still moving forward." He didn't wait for a response. He ended the call politely. Then he sat back down, reopened his notebook, and underlined one word 3 times. Cornerstone. The grainy footage flickered. Barely HD, colors washed out like an old postcard. JD Vance had seen plenty of college reels, but this was different. This wasn't the NFL. This wasn't Trey Hendrickson in a roaring stadium. This was a high school game on a muddy field in Apopka, Florida. A beat-up helmet, a kid with 2 long sleeves, and eyes that didn't seem to chase glory. Just contact. Trey didn't start his freshman year. Too raw, too quiet. Coaches like noise, showmanship, the ones who made eye contact and cracked jokes in interviews. Trey just stared through people. Not rude, just still. He was a misfit among future stars, second string on paper, invisible in person. But he never missed practice. Not once. He ran harder in warm-ups than starters did in games. No music in his headphones, just tape, always tape, replays of drills, angles, shoulder positioning, grip. By sophomore year, the coaches let him start on a rainy Friday night when their lead rusher was out sick. He didn't say a word in the locker room, just nodded, strapped up, and walked onto the field like he'd been there 100 times. He didn't score that night. He hit. He held. He collapsed a pocket 3 times, forced a fumble, recovered one. No one celebrated harder than Trey's teammates. He barely raised his hand. Next Monday, he was back early, alone on the field running sprints. They still didn't notice him on the state recruitment charts. One coach from Florida Atlantic scribbled, "Good footwork, lacks flash." Another from Georgia Southern said, "Discipline, but not a spark plug." Trey saw the notes. They didn't bother him. Not really. He just worked harder. By senior year, he quietly led the district in sacks for the 3rd year in a row. No headlines, no interviews, no dance moves. Just a nod to the sideline and back to the huddle. His teammates loved him. Not because he was loud, but because he never let up. One lineman said, "You always felt safer when he was on your side." That became a theme, something JD would one day latch on to without even realizing why. Because there was something about Trey that didn't fit into the scouting formulas. He wasn't fast. He was constant. He wasn't flashy. He was faithful. In the final playoff game of his high school career, his team was down by 4. 42 seconds left. The other team had the ball in the lead. One first down would end it. Trey didn't say a word in the huddle. He just lined up, dug his cleats in, and broke through the left guard like paper. The quarterback never saw it coming. Fumble. Trey didn't recover it. Someone else did. They won the game. The fans cheered the score. Cameras zoomed in on the recovery. Trey stood quietly near the sideline, helmet off, breathing hard. No fist pumps, no posing. Just a quiet look toward the scoreboard, and then back to the bench. Later, when asked why he didn't celebrate, he just shrugged. "I was already thinking about the next play." By the time Trey Hendrickson made it to the NFL, he was still the same kid from high school. The helmet was shinier, the crowd louder, and the contracts larger, but nothing in his body language said, "I made it." If anything, he just looked more focused. He was never the loudest in the locker room, never the one blasting music, flexing cleats, or hyping up the cameras during pregame warm-ups. But among the players who mattered, the ones who really built a team, Trey was already legendary. Rookies noticed it first. They were the last to be seen, the first to be blamed. They fetched the pads, filled the coolers, took the hits in practice. But every now and then, after a brutal full-contact drill, a rookie would find a Gatorade waiting for him, or a veteran's hand on his shoulder pad, or a note in his locker. "Tough reps today. Don't let it shake you." The handwriting never said who it was from, but everyone knew. Trey Hendrickson. He wasn't the type to make speeches in the locker room. He didn't need to. He was the guy who stayed behind after walkthroughs to sweep tape off the turf. The one who carried pads when the interns were swamped. The player who showed up to team breakfast 30 minutes early so the younger guys didn't have to sit alone. "He doesn't just stop plays," one assistant coach said. "He stops egos." It wasn't just a compliment. It was a warning to new players, to guys who thought success gave them permission to treat others like dirt. Trey didn't talk trash, but if you made a rookie feel small during practice, Trey would make sure you felt invisible during the next game. He'd block for you, yes, but he wouldn't cover for you. He led with standards, not speeches. At team dinners, he never sat at the veterans table. He rotated seats, learned names. He was the first to know when someone's grandmother passed away. The first to buy a round when a practice squad player got promoted to the main roster. He didn't need the spotlight because he understood structure, that not every stronghold was built on star power. Some were built on presence, quiet, consistent, immovable. And in a world where social media celebrated highlight reels, Trey became a highlight in people's lives, not in their feeds. One story leaked out, but never from him. A rookie wide receiver, recently cut, had nowhere to go. No money for rent, no family nearby. Before the player could even ask, Trey had already called a teammate with an empty guest house and quietly paid the first 3 months up front. He never told a soul. The rookie did 2 years later in tears during an interview. "I asked him why he helped me. He said, because someone once helped me and never asked why." That's how he operated, not in headlines, but in habits. And those habits made him the person teammates trusted when no one else could be trusted. When a coach yelled too hard, when a personal scandal broke, when a player's wife was hospitalized during playoffs. They called Trey. He wasn't their best player. He was their best constant. And in an NFL locker room where fame fades faster than speed, constancy was gold. There's a kind of man who never appears in headlines. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't pose for the camera. He fixes what's broken, leaves before the credit rolls, and returns the next morning as if nothing happened. J.D. Vance grew up around those men, and one of them, the one, was his Uncle Ray. Ray worked the floor at a factory in Middletown for 30 years. Machines, conveyor belts, welding stations. He could take them apart and rebuild them by feel alone. He didn't own a college degree, never applied for a promotion, and never missed a shift, not even when his back went out. Not even the day after his wife left. He came in early, left late, rarely talked. But when something broke, anything, really, people looked to Ray. JD remembered being a boy, sitting on a metal stool at the back of the workshop, watching his uncle in grease-covered coveralls tighten a bolt no one else could reach. Not because he was the only one strong enough, but because he was the only one still trying when everyone else gave up. He never made headlines, JD once told a staffer, but he held us together. That memory didn't come back during a speech or a campaign. It came back the night he watched Trey Hendrickson on tape, alone in his office. And he saw something familiar, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Not just toughness, not even consistency, but a refusal to need the credit. It was the way Trey hit the line and got up first, the way he lifted teammates without lifting himself, the way he walked past the press, past the cameras, like the real win was simply showing up again tomorrow. JD didn't see a football player. He saw a public version of Ray. And in a political world bloated with performance, where every quote was crafted, every stance tested by pollsters, Trey reminded JD of something that had nothing to do with strategy. There are two kinds of men, Ray used to say, the ones who wait to be told what to do, and the ones who don't need to be asked. Trey was the second kind, the kind who built cultures, not careers, the kind who stood between others and harm, not for applause, but because someone had to. That's why JD said his name at the mic, not to shock, not to trend, but to make sure that for once, someone like that wouldn't go unnoticed. In Washington, it was easy to forget those men, easy to pretend the only voices that mattered were the ones heard through microphones. But JD knew better. He had lived better. And when his advisors asked him, why him? Why now? He didn't offer a speech. He just held up the printout of a news article. One line highlighted, Trey Hendrickson, quietest leader in the NFL. Then he looked them in the eye. Because if we can't recognize someone like that, we don't deserve to lead anyone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. And in that stillness, the room understood. JD didn't just see Trey, he recognized him. The silence after JD's last meeting didn't last long. By the time he returned to his office, 3 aides were already waiting, 2 seated, 1 pacing. A 4th entered mid-sentence, holding a folder marked Polling Retention plus Risk. Paige Whitmore, his chief strategist, didn't wait for him to sit. We've got a situation. The clip's been cut a dozen ways. It's trending, but not the way we want. The base is confused. Seniors think you're going soft. Independents think you're distracted. JD closed the door behind him, hung his coat, and said nothing. Another advisor leaned forward. Sir, with respect, this isn't polling well with older voters. They don't watch the NFL. They don't know who Trey Hendrickson is. They want to hear about Medicare, not locker room culture. JD turned to the window. Gray skies above the Capitol. A steady drizzle blurring the monuments into memory. Paige flipped the folder open. This was a good week to hit fiscal messaging hard, but you went off script, and now we're burning airtime explaining a football metaphor. It wasn't a metaphor, JD said, still facing the window. Silence. Then the youngest aide in the room, Jordan, recently transferred from another office, eager to impress, cleared his throat. I mean, even from a symbolic standpoint, is Trey the best example? He's too quiet. Not a face of the franchise guy. No endorsements, no social presence, not a lot of star power. JD turned, not sharply, slowly, deliberately, like someone who'd heard just enough. That's the point, he said. He plays for the team, not the camera. He took a breath, walked to the table, tapped a knuckle gently on the polling folder. Let me ask you something. What do you think older voters miss most? Hype or honesty? No one answered. They don't want perfection. They want someone who remembers what it's like to be part of something bigger than themselves. Paige exhaled. She wasn't rattled. She was calculating. But how does that help us in next quarter's messaging cycle? JD pulled a chair, sat down slowly. Because we're not running to win cycles. We're running to build trust. And that starts when we stop talking only about the visible wins and start honoring the invisible ones. He opened his notebook, slid it across the table. One line circled in red. We survive because of defense. He's not flashy, JD continued, but when the pocket collapses and everything feels like it's going to fall apart, he's the one that's still standing, still hitting, still taking the hits no one else wants. A long pause followed. Paige folded her arms, her voice lower now. I get it, sir. I do. But this path is harder. It's riskier. JD met her eyes. So was running for Senate in the first place. He stood, tugged his coat off the rack. We've spent years telling Americans to trust leadership. Maybe it's time we show them what we trust. And I trust Trey Hendrickson. No one argued, but no one nodded either. He walked to the door, opened it, then turned back with a quiet intensity that cut deeper than any shout. If we lose momentum because I defended a man like that, then maybe we were never building the right kind to begin with. He left the room before anyone could speak, and inside the team sat in silence, less angry than unsure. Because sometimes the scariest move in politics isn't the wrong one. It's the one that feels too honest to spin. That night, long after his staff had gone home, and the halls of the Senate were quiet enough to hear the hum of air vents, J.D. Vance sat alone at his desk, fingers grazing the edges of a stack of unopened letters. They arrived daily, handwritten, typed, emailed, mailed twice. Most were noise, praise, complaints, political gambles wrapped as policy suggestions. He'd read the first line of each, then passed them along. But tonight, one envelope was different. Cream-colored, slightly bent. No return address, just a single line of text across the back flap. Please read this yourself. No staff. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded cleanly down the center. The handwriting was neat but pressed hard, like the pen had been clenched too tightly. He could almost feel the weight behind every word. Senator Vance, I'm a Marine veteran from Preston County, West Virginia. I met Trey Hendrickson 2 years ago during a team outreach at a VA hospital in Cincinnati. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't on the list. I just came along with a friend who needed help walking. I figured no one would notice me. But he did. JD kept reading, slower now. While the cameras were with the star quarterback, Trey broke away from the group. I was sitting alone, trying not to make eye contact, because that's what you learn to do when you feel like you're no longer needed. He sat next to me, asked if I played ball. I told him I didn't. I was artillery. He said, then you played the kind that matters. And he just stayed. Didn't ask anything of me. Didn't pretend to get it. Just sat like we were equals. Not charity, not pity. I didn't feel like a burden around him. He saw me. JD didn't realize he'd stopped breathing. He looked up from the page, the hum of the vents louder now somehow. That line, he saw me. It echoed, not in the room, in his ribs. He leaned back in his chair, let the letter fall gently to the desk. It hadn't been written for the public. It wasn't sent to win a headline or boost a bill. It was someone reaching through the noise with something real. No hashtags, no slogans. Just a quiet truth. JD looked to his right, where a leather binder sat unopened. Inside were pages of stats, polling summaries, bullet points for the floor speech he was scheduled to give in the coming days. Something about national defense, strategic deterrence, voter reassurance, all carefully constructed, all perfectly hollow compared to this one-page letter. He reached for the letter again, folded it back along its original crease with care, and tucked it gently into the inner pocket of his coat, the same pocket where his speech notes would go. He didn't plan to quote it, or show it, or hold it up as proof, but he knew he'd carry it with him, not as a prop, as a reminder of what mattered when the room got loud, of who he was speaking for when no one else knew why, of a man who didn't need a microphone to be heard, and of a moment between two strangers, one forgotten by war, the other remembered by presence. JD looked out the window. Capitol Hill was still, and somewhere in that stillness, he felt the quiet begin to build its case. 3 days later, the chamber was packed. Not because of him. The calendar showed a vote on tax reform amendments. Dry, procedural, expected. Senators scrolled their phones. Pages rustled papers. C-SPAN's live feed flickered to life with the usual drudgery, until J.D. Vance stood and asked for the floor. Paige, watching from the gallery above, stiffened. This wasn't planned, not in any of the 5 drafts his team had written, not in the press release prepped for tomorrow, not in the comms strategy painstakingly built to redirect attention from his earlier Hendrickson remarks. J.D. adjusted his mic, looked up, not at the cameras, not even at his colleagues, but at the empty upper balcony, and began. Mr. President, I know today's agenda is about reconciliation, but I rise to speak not just about numbers, but about the values behind them. A few heads turned. He continued, we often say a budget reflects our priorities, but I think it also reflects who we reward and why. Now the room quieted. That wasn't from any committee memo. Do we reward volume, flash, followers, or do we reward commitment, grit, the kind of presence that doesn't trend on social media, but without which nothing works? A few senators leaned in. J.D. scanned the room. He wasn't reading from his notes. He was reading from something deeper. I want to talk about the Americans who show up when no one's looking. A high school teacher in Dayton who keeps paying for her students' lunches after the budget runs out. A janitor in Akron who hasn't taken a sick day in 17 years because the building doesn't open if he doesn't unlock it. He paused, then looked straight ahead. And yes, a defensive end from Cincinnati who's kept more than quarterbacks from advancing. He's protected locker rooms from division, rookies from embarrassment, teammates from feeling alone. That may not be glamorous, but it's necessary, and it's honorable. Silence, total. Some didn't know who he was talking about. Some did, and shifted in their seats, unsure what to make of it. J.D. went on. We've gotten used to mistaking spotlight for service. We forget that every nation strong enough to endure does so because of the quiet strength at its foundation. Then softer, nearly lost to the mic. The cornerstone isn't loud. It just never cracks. He stepped back. No thunderous applause, just a stillness. Like the room had been caught between breath and meaning. He didn't wait for reactions. He simply nodded to the chair, reclaimed his seat, and opened a blank page in his notebook. 3 rows back, a senator whispered to his colleague, "What the hell was that?" In the press gallery, a Politico reporter was already typing. J.D. Vance goes off script, elevates defensive end in floor speech. Another tweet followed moments later. Ohio Senator praises Trey Hendrickson in budget speech, calls him a cornerstone of commitment. Political stunt or something deeper? The headlines would split like lightning forks. Critics would pounce. Strategists would scramble. But in that moment, none of it mattered to J.D. because the room had gone still, and sometimes stillness means people finally heard you. The next morning, J.D. Vance's office was already under siege. Headlines churned. Vance hijacks budget debate for NFL sermon. Political theater or personal obsession? Senator uses Senate floor to praise football player, confuses nation. But amidst the flood of angry emails and dismissive editorials, a single voicemail slipped through quietly. It wasn't from a lobbyist, not from a network anchor, not even from a donor. It was from a middle school principal in Cincinnati. Her voice, low and deliberate, crackled through the phone line. Senator Vance, you don't know me, and I doubt Mr. Hendrickson would want me calling, but after your remarks yesterday, I feel like I'm supposed to tell you something. She paused. Years ago, I had a student, 10 years old, bright eyes, quiet, always drawing in the back of class. He was diagnosed with leukemia halfway through the school year. His family didn't have insurance. J.D. listened, frozen mid-step. The message continued. They were looking at 6 figures in medical bills. They were ready to lose their house. We held a fundraiser, but it barely made a dent. Then one day the hospital called the family, told them the balance had been cleared. Every cent, another pause. The family thought it was a clerical error. They were too scared to ask. The only thing we ever knew was that someone made it go away. J.D. furrowed his brow. He was about to hit replay when she added one final sentence. Yesterday, when you said his name, I finally knew who paid it. Silence. Then the line cut off. J.D. stood motionless in the hallway of the Hart Senate office building. The early morning buzz faded behind him. All he could hear was the memory of that boy, someone he had never met, and someone Trey Hendrickson had never needed to be seen helping. No press release, no tweet, no stage photo in a hospital hallway. Just a quiet, surgical kindness that expected nothing back. Back in his office, he replayed the message twice. Then he called her directly. Her name was Donna Reyes. She sounded surprised he called. "I wasn't trying to start anything," she said quickly. "I just thought, after what you said, maybe you'd want to know the kind of man you were defending." JD smiled gently. "I wasn't defending him," he said. "I was defending what we forgot to value." Donna hesitated, then laughed softly. "Well, you found it." That afternoon, JD didn't bring it up in interviews. He didn't leak it to media allies. He didn't even tell his closest advisors. He just printed the transcript of the voicemail and slid it into the same folder where the Marine's letter lived. Now thicker, now heavier. That night, when he zipped up his coat and walked out under the marble arches, he felt something shift in the weight of his jacket. Not from the pages, but from what they represented. Some stories didn't need retweeting. They just needed remembering. And Trey Hendrickson's legacy was slowly becoming one of those stories. It took 2 days for J.D. Vance to find the family. Not through an aide, not through publicity, just a quiet phone call to Principal Donna Reyes and a name written on the inside of an old thank you card. The boy's name was Marcus. He was 12 now, stronger, in remission, but his parents still spoke like they were holding their breath between miracles. JD didn't bring a camera crew, no photographer, no press aide trailing 6 steps behind with a statement prepped for media. He arrived in a used gray sedan and knocked once, lightly, on the door of a small red brick home on the edge of Mount Healthy, Ohio. The mother, Jasmine, opened the door and froze. For a second, JD thought she didn't recognize him. Then she blinked, stepped back, and whispered, "You know, don't you?" He nodded once. She let him inside. The living room was modest. A couch frayed at the edges, a Christmas photo still sitting on the mantel, untouched since the day it was taken. JD looked closer. In the corner of the frame, behind the family, stood Trey Hendrickson. No helmet, no jersey, just a hoodie and a tired smile. Jasmine sat down, clutching a pillow. "He didn't just pay the bills," she said. "He showed up." JD didn't speak. It was Christmas Eve. Marcus was weak, bald, pale, barely opening his eyes. Trey walked in without any fanfare. No press, no Bengals rep, just him. He sat next to Marcus, held his hand and said, "Fight like it's 4th and goal, kid. You're not going out on 3rd down." Her voice cracked. She wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. And Marcus smiled, for the first time in weeks. JD swallowed hard. Something tightened in his chest. The boy, Marcus, peeked in from the hallway. JD waved gently. Marcus grinned shyly and darted away, his small footsteps pattering down the hallway like a fading drumbeat. Jasmine turned back to JD. "We wanted to tell the world, but Trey made us promise not to. He said it wasn't about him." JD stared at the photo again. There were no headlines, no interviews, no social media hashtags, just one man showing up when it mattered most and asking to remain invisible. After a long pause, JD rose from the couch. Jasmine walked him to the door. Before he stepped out, she touched his sleeve. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. "No," he replied. "Thank him. I'm just catching up." Outside, the wind had picked up. JD pulled his coat tight, stepped into the cold, and paused under a flickering street lamp. He looked back at the house, simple, unassuming, still standing because someone had held it up in a storm no one saw. He took a breath, deeper than usual, because what he just witnessed wasn't policy, it wasn't polling, it was purpose. And for the first time in weeks, J.D. Vance felt like he wasn't defending a controversial move on the Senate floor. He was defending a man whose quiet legacy was already changing lives, without asking for permission or praise. That night, J.D. Vance was supposed to be prepping for a major fundraiser in Columbus. The speech had already been drafted. Safe language, clear talking points, economic statistics, sliced clean for donor appeal. A room full of business leaders would be waiting with folded arms and open checkbooks. But back in his D.C. apartment, J.D. didn't even open the draft. He sat at the table alone, the lights low, a worn legal pad in front of him. He stared at it for a moment. Then he wrote 4 words across the top. The ones who stay. Not win, not lead, not go viral. Stay. His mind flashed to the Christmas photo on the mantle, to Jasmine's cracked voice, to the way Trey never let the moment become his. JD scribbled the first few lines in silence, only the scratching of the pen filling the apartment. The rhythm came slowly, then all at once, as if it had been waiting to be written long before the news cycle ever started. He wrote about his uncle, the factory mechanic who missed family barbecues to cover second shifts. He wrote about teachers who bought notebooks with their own paychecks. He wrote about a janitor named Mr. Allen, who once handed JD a granola bar before a high school exam and said, "Get it done, soldier." And then finally he wrote about a man named Trey Hendrickson, not for a sack, not for a tackle, but for a promise made in a hospital room, with no audience, no spotlight, no contract extension. He titled the speech, "The Ones Who Stay When the Lights Are Off." The final line took him the longest. He stared at it, rewrote it, crossed it out, wrote it again. Finally, he circled it twice and underlined it once. You don't need to see someone score to know they saved the game. The next morning, his aides tried to hand him the original fundraiser script. He shook his head. "We're going with this one." They glanced at the title and exchanged worried looks. "Sir, it doesn't hit the key economic indicators." JD folded the pages and slid them into his coat pocket. "It hits the ones we forgot to count." The fundraiser was held in a cavernous hall, lit with soft amber chandeliers and the low hum of wealth in conversation. When JD stepped up to the podium, the room didn't hush immediately. Some kept chatting, glancing at their watches, until he spoke the first line. "Let me tell you about a man you've never seen spike a ball, but who helped save a child on Christmas Eve." The murmurs stopped. He spoke not of tax brackets or deregulation, but of janitors and quiet linemen and teachers who stayed after dismissal. He never raised his voice, but you could hear a pin drop. The final words came like a soft punch to the chest. You don't need to see someone score to know they saved the game. There was no thunderous applause, just a pause, a deep one. Then one by one they stood, not in excitement, but in respect. Backstage, JD didn't wait for the post-event debrief. He just folded the speech, tucked it next to the letters in his coat pocket, and walked quietly into the night. He didn't need the headlines this time. He had the echo. And for once, that was enough. The morning after JD's speech, the headlines weren't about policy. They were about a football player and a senator who dared to say his name on the Senate floor. JD Vance praises linemen over legislation, sneered one cable news Chiron. Is the Senate now ESPN? Another joked. Hashtags trended. Hashtag tackles not taxes. Hashtag gridiron grandstanding. Hashtag JD cheerleader. And then came the soundbite. On a live panel discussion, Senator Blake Farnsworth of Arizona leaned into the camera, smirking as he delivered the blow. So we're cheerleading now? Is this what the Senate has become? A locker room pep talk? The clip spread like wildfire. Within hours, every Sunday host, every political podcaster, every influencer with a blue check mark had an opinion. Some mocked JD mercilessly. Others tried to out-snark the original jab. Will JD endorse mascots next? Guess defense wins votes now too? But JD didn't flinch. At his weekly press briefing, a young journalist tossed him the quote with a grin. Senator Farnsworth says your remarks were cheerleading. Care to comment? JD stood still behind the podium. He didn't smile, didn't raise his voice. If you don't know the value of selflessness, he said, tone even but firm, maybe sit this one out. The room went quiet. No cue cards, no spin, just clarity. Then he leaned in, just slightly. There's a reason we remember who blocked for the quarterback when he stood up. Not everyone does, but the ones who did made it possible. Some reporters blinked, others scribbled fast. The moment hit, subtle but sharp, like a scalpel rather than a hammer. But the internet was already boiling. On Twitter, the reactions split straight down party lines, and something deeper. One thread read, JD's gone soft. Football metaphors won't lower gas prices. Another pushed back. Finally, a politician who gets it. Character still matters. A military veteran chimed in. If this is cheerleading, give me a pom-pom. Trey came to my base once. No cameras, just respect. Cable networks pounced. One right-leaning outlet looped Farnsworth's line 5 times in 30 minutes. A progressive panel dismissed the speech as emotional posturing to mask legislative thinness. But somewhere in the middle, a different conversation emerged. Clips of JD's full speech began circulating. Not the viral quote, but the slow build. Janitors, teachers, his uncle, and finally Trey. People weren't just listening, they were thinking. And that was what JD had hoped for all along. Back at his office, his senior aide Julie looked tense. They're calling for you to walk it back. JD barely looked up from the stack of handwritten letters piling on his desk. Then they're not listening. Sir, we have donors threatening to pull support. Good, JD replied calmly. Then we'll know which ones were buying silence. Julie sighed, hesitated, then nodded. JD's gaze returned to one letter in particular. A retired teacher in Cincinnati had written, "You reminded me that what I did for 40 years mattered, even if no one clapped." He smiled faintly. The room outside buzzed with calls, schedules, tension. But inside his office it was quiet, steady, because JD Vance knew something the headlines couldn't measure. This wasn't about praise. It was about reminding the country of something it had forgotten how to value. And no senator's joke, no matter how loud, could drown that out. The lights were colder than expected. JD sat across from the primetime host on one of the most watched nightly political shows in America. Polished backdrop, sleek desk, producers counting down in his ear. He was prepped, coached, and told to stay on message. But that was before the first question landed, hard. Senator Vance, be honest. Was this an emotional overreach? Using your Senate platform to praise a football player? Some say it's performative at best, misguided at worst. JD didn't answer right away. He looked into the camera, then just slightly off to the side, where he imagined the faces of people who had written him letters all week. The teacher, the vet, the janitor's daughter, and that boy in the hospital. He took a breath. I know what it looks like, JD said finally. A politician talking football in the middle of a budget fight. But what people miss is that this wasn't about football. Not really. The host leaned in. So what was it about, Senator? JD's voice didn't rise, it deepened. Years ago, a boy was in hospice, final stage cancer, no hope left. It was Christmas Eve, and his parents were preparing to say goodbye. No press, no headlines, no rally. And that night, a man walked into that hospital room. He wasn't a senator, wasn't a priest, just a defensive end with a quiet soul. JD paused. The studio was utterly still. He told that boy to fight like it was 4th and goal. He didn't cry, he didn't pity, he just stood next to him and gave him strength. That boy lived 6 more months, and when he passed, the family didn't remember the cancer. They remembered that night, that voice, that presence, because it made their son feel seen. JD's hands were folded calmly on the table now, but there was something alive in his voice, controlled but raw. I'm not in the Senate to trade barbs or memorize polling memos. I'm there to remind us who we are when the cameras aren't rolling. So if I have to stand on the Senate floor and say a name that half the room smirks at, then so be it, because that man, Trey Hendrickson, is what I want my sons to grow up to be. The host, usually sharp and ready to pounce, blinked. There was a beat too long before the next question. He glanced at his notes and skipped to something else, muttering, well, that certainly reframes it. But by then, the moment had already taken off. Clips of the interview exploded online. Within the hour, Trey's name was trending, but not for stats or highlights. Hashtag real cornerstone, hashtag fight like it's 4th, hashtag he stood next to him. They weren't hashtags crafted by consultants. They were started by nurses, by cancer survivors, by parents who'd watched their children battle the unthinkable. By morning, the video had been seen by over 9 million people. JD's press team woke up to a new kind of inbox, overflowing with notes that read, not, I support your policy, but You made me feel again. He reminded me of my brother. Thank you for seeing someone no one else did. And somewhere in Cincinnati, Trey Hendrickson turned off the TV. He didn't call anyone, didn't tweet, just showed up to morning practice, early as usual, taped his wrist, nodded to his teammates, and went to work. No celebration, just the game. By the time J.D. Vance arrived at his office the next morning, the inbox was already breaking protocol. Digital cues were maxed out. Aides were printing emails by the stack just to keep up. Over 2,000 letters. Not from lobbyists, not from media, from bus drivers, nurses, janitors, factory workers, coaches, the kind of people who weren't used to writing senators. One note came hand-scrawled on the back of a grocery receipt. Another was typed by a substitute teacher in Georgia, who simply wrote, "I never knew someone like me had a place in your speeches." But there was one envelope, creased, watermarked by the faint trace of sweat or maybe tears, that J.D. couldn't put down. It was from a janitor in Pennsylvania. No return address, no social media handle, just a note and an old photo of a middle school hallway. Senator Vance, I've worked at night since I was 19. Most folks walk past me like I'm the wallpaper. But when you said the name of that football player, not for his fame, but for who he was off the field, I sat in my supply closet and cried. For once, someone stood for people like us. You didn't need a stadium. You just needed a microphone. And you used it. That matters. J.D. stared at it longer than he meant to. He walked out of his office without a word, stood at the rotunda window, and let the early sunlight hit his shoulders. He thought of the janitor, of Trey, of his uncle in Middletown who fixed broken things no one thanked him for. Back in his office, without consulting his press team, he snapped a photo of the letter and posted it to his public account. No filter. No edits. Just the caption. He wrote from a supply closet. I read it from the Senate. That's the America I listened to. It went viral in under an hour. Cable news tried to spin it. Some called it calculated, others called it a distraction. But outside the Beltway, the country didn't care about spin. It resonated. Teachers printed the letter and taped it to their break room walls. Middle school basketball teams started practice with a chant, "We fight like it's fourth." A mom in Indiana sent in a picture of her son in a Trey Hendrickson jersey with the caption, "Not because he plays football, but because he shows up." Even former critics began to soften. A respected columnist who had once mocked J.D. for sentimental detours wrote a rare column titled, "Maybe what we mock is what we miss." By Friday, the narrative had shifted entirely. The senator who'd once been accused of grandstanding had become the man reminding the country that value isn't always loud. When asked at a press scrum if he planned to capitalize on the moment politically, J.D. smiled faintly. There's nothing to capitalize on. I just gave the mic back to the people who earned it. It was a quiet answer. But like everything J.D. had said since that press room surprise, it traveled. By week's end, 47 different state newspapers had reprinted the janitor's letter. And tucked into the frame in J.D.'s office, next to family photos, degrees, and political plaques, sat one new item, a folded piece of paper, creased and unassuming, that started in a supply closet and echoed across a country. At 8:10 a.m., in a modest high school on the outskirts of Louisville, sunlight filtered through dusty blinds onto rows of desks etched with initials and hearts carved during algebra. Room 212 didn't look like the kind of place where movement started, but today something quiet was shifting. Mr. Ellison, a civics teacher 3 years from retirement, stood at the front of his senior government class, remote in hand, a YouTube link queued. He cleared his throat. Today we're going to listen to a Senate speech, not because it's on the exam, he said, glancing at the yawning back row, but because sometimes government surprises you. The video flickered onto the screen. J.D. Vance's voice filled the room. And yes, a defensive end who's kept more than quarterbacks from advancing. No laughter, no snickers, only stillness. The speech was short, just under 7 minutes, but by the end no one had touched their phones. Even Taylor, who usually snuck earbuds under her hoodie, was staring forward. Silence held the room for a moment after the video ended. Then a boy in the second row leaned toward his desk partner and whispered, "I didn't know people like that got noticed." It wasn't meant for the room, but Mr. Ellison heard it. He looked at the class, his eyes softer than usual. "They do now." And he meant it. He pulled out a folder and laid it on the overhead projector. Inside, clippings of the janitor's letter, a quote from JD's viral tweet, a printed-out photo of a Trey Hendrickson jersey on a hospital wall in Indiana. "These," Mr. Ellison said, tapping the papers gently, "aren't political stunts. They're moments, and moments like this remind us what public service is supposed to sound like." A hand rose in the front. Sasha, shy and sharp, asked, "But why would a senator talk about football? Isn't that risky?" Mr. Ellison smiled. "Maybe, but sometimes courage is saying something that doesn't fit the script, and sometimes the only way to get a country's attention is to speak its language." He paused, watching their faces. "You don't get remembered for safe speeches. You get remembered for honest ones." A bell rang faintly from the hallway, but no one moved. Not right away. One by one, they packed their bags more slowly than usual, like they weren't ready to leave the room. A few lingered, glancing again at the still image of JD standing at the Senate podium. As they filtered out, Mr. Ellison wrote something new on the whiteboard. "Integrity doesn't trend, until it does." Down the hall, a girl named Maya texted her older brother. "We watched this senator today. He talked about a football player, but it felt like he was talking about Dad." Meanwhile, Mr. Ellison slipped the folder back into his briefcase and muttered, not to anyone in particular, "They'll forget the name, but they'll remember the moment." The morning after JD's speech aired again on local networks, his office mailbox started swelling. Not with formal policy memos or donor packages, but handwritten letters. They came in different shapes, sizes, and inks, some typed with trembling fingers, some scribbled with pencil on lined paper. Torn from spiral notebooks. His chief of staff laid the first stack on his desk without a word. JD looked at them. No logos, no lobbying seals, just names, just stories. The first letter he opened came from a man named Harold, 72 years old, who had worked at an aluminum plant in Kentucky for 4 decades. His handwriting was slanted, precise, like someone who used to keep ledgers. "I never made more than $38,000 a year," Harold wrote, "but I always showed up. When you talked about Trey, I felt like, just for a minute, you were talking about men like me." JD sat back, letter trembling in his hand. It wasn't policy feedback, it was something heavier, something sacred. The next was from a Gold Star widow. Her name was Eliza. "My husband was the kind of man who helped shovel neighbors' driveways before deployment," she wrote. "Your speech reminded me of him. And Trey reminds me of the brothers who stood by his side." JD folded the page slowly. A whisper of grief came with it. You couldn't file that kind of testimony into a database. Letter after letter spoke of men and women who'd never graced headlines but held families, communities, even quiet corners of America together. A retired nurse, a high school football coach, a janitor from Cleveland who enclosed a Polaroid of his team sweeping the gym after a championship game. They didn't talk politics. They talked about character. "My son works 2 jobs and doesn't complain," one note read. "When you said Trey was a cornerstone, I thought of him." The flood wasn't just in paper. JD's voicemail filled with trembling voices, a school teacher from Topeka, a diner waitress from Georgia. One even came from a correctional officer who said, "We're not the easiest people to cheer for, but thanks for trying." By week's end, JD's team had to assign 2 interns just to catalog the responses. And yet, it wasn't the volume that hit JD hardest. It was the common thread. These weren't just fan mail. These were testaments. People weren't thanking him for supporting an athlete. They were thanking him for noticing lives like theirs still mattered. That someone saw past the highlight reels, past the noise, and pointed toward the quiet ones, those who build, defend, and sacrifice without applause. Back in his office late one evening, JD placed several letters in a small wooden box. He didn't label it. He didn't have to. He knew what it held. And as he closed the lid, he whispered a line he hadn't said aloud in years. "The America I come from is still here." Outside, Washington's skyline blinked in soft amber. But inside that quiet room, something felt rooted, something real. The day the final box of letters arrived, JD came into the Senate office earlier than usual. The corridors were still empty, lights buzzing softly, as if the building itself hadn't quite woken up. He carried a plain brown frame under his arm, no aide by his side, no cameras trailing him. He unlocked his office, pushed the door open slowly, and walked to the back wall, the one left bare ever since he'd taken the seat. Not out of indecision, but because he hadn't yet lived a moment worthy of putting there. Until now. Inside the frame was a still photo, not from a press release or game day moment. It was grainy, taken by a hospital nurse, later sent to JD by the boy's mother. In it, Trey Hendrickson sat quietly beside a child's hospital bed, one hand on the boy's shoulder, the other holding a small Bengals towel, folded like a flag. JD had stared at that photo for days before deciding what to do with it. It wasn't grand, it wasn't posed, but it was everything. He straightened the frame on the wall and stepped back. Beneath the image was a brass plate he'd had engraved himself. They didn't sign him for stats. They signed him for what stats can't measure. No applause, no spotlight. Just a reminder, silent but immovable. As the day went on, staffers entered the office one by one. Their chatter slowed when they saw the new frame. No one asked about it. They didn't need to. By lunch, a few senators stopped by. Some gave it a passing glance. One made a dismissive comment. "You should have used a picture from the playoffs." JD didn't reply. He simply gestured toward the brass plate. Later that afternoon, a janitor who'd cleaned the office weekly for 2 years stood staring at the frame. JD caught sight of him from inside. "You know him?" JD asked casually. The man nodded. "Not personally, but I know what that moment feels like. I've had a son in that bed." JD walked over and stood beside him. "That's why it's here." The janitor smiled faintly. "Then it's in the right place." When the room emptied again, JD sat down at his desk. The flood of voices from the past week, bus drivers, nurses, old factory men, all seemed to echo in that stillness. All of them had one thing in common. They weren't asking for fame, just to be seen. Trey had become more than a name on a contract, more than a headline. He'd become a symbol, not of athletic dominance, but of the people who quietly hold America together when no one's watching. That was what JD had seen. That was what no poll could measure. He leaned back, eyes lingering on the photo once more, and thought of his uncle. 30 years fixing machines, no plaques, no pension speeches, but a cornerstone in his own right. Maybe that's why it mattered so deeply, because legacy wasn't about numbers. It was about moments, the ones that don't make the front page but stay in the heart forever. As the Capitol buzzed back to life outside, JD closed his notebook and looked at the photo one last time, not to admire it, but to remember. The news broke quietly at first, just a tweet from the Bengals official account. No fireworks, no hype video. Just 6 words that lit a quiet fire across the city. Trey Hendrickson, extended. 4 more years. Within minutes, the announcement rippled through Cincinnati like a heartbeat returning to a patient mid-flatline. Phones buzzed. Radios echoed the news with barely restrained enthusiasm. Sports commentators nodded in approval, but it was the everyday people who truly reacted. Barber shops, deli counters, construction sites. The sentiment was unanimous, not just relief but vindication. This wasn't just about a player staying, it was about a principle holding. At Paycor Stadium, the Bengals were scheduled for an open practice, the kind where families bring lawn chairs and little kids wear oversized jerseys. No one expected anything major that day, but when Trey jogged onto the field, the crowd sensed something different. No pomp, no announcement, just Trey, head down, helmet in hand, sleeves rolled, eyes humble. And then someone stood up in the third row. A retired school teacher, graying and frail, lifted a homemade sign. "Thanks for being what they forget to cheer for." A slow clap started from her row, spread like thunder across the bleachers, and within moments the entire stadium was on its feet. The roar wasn't wild, it was rooted, grounded, a kind of applause that didn't scream celebrity, but gratitude. From halfway up the crowd, seated beneath the shade of a plain ball cap and sunglasses, J.D. Vance stood too. No cameras caught him, no reporters circled. He hadn't come for visibility. He came for something else. Maybe to see if the story had landed. Not the press clips or op-eds, but the real story. Of grit, of unseen heroes, of quiet valor being honored out loud for once. As the applause settled into a hum of conversation, JD kept his eyes on Trey. He wasn't acknowledging the crowd. He was stretching, focused, ready to work. That's what moved JD most. No victory lap, no flex. Just another rep. A father near him whispered to his son, "That's the guy I told you about, the one who doesn't play for the cameras." The boy nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. Later that afternoon, a sideline reporter asked Trey about the new contract. He shrugged. "It's not about the years, it's about what I do with them." The clip went viral, not for its flash, but for its weight. Back in D.C., JD's office received a new letter. Handwritten, no return address. Just 2 sentences. "He plays like you speak, quiet, but it echoes." JD placed the note beside the brass plate under the photo on his office wall. He didn't need a bigger frame, just a longer memory. The story had begun with a wrong microphone, an unexpected detour in a press briefing. But here, in the roar of a stadium and the silence of a senator's office, it had found its home. And in that home, applause wasn't noise. It was acknowledgement. The clapping hadn't faded when a quiet moment bloomed in Row D, section 113. A father, somewhere in his late 40s, tugged gently on his son's sleeve. The boy, maybe 9, maybe 10, still had his hands in the air, caught in the afterglow of applause. His oversized Bengals hoodie hung off his shoulders, the name Hendrickson stitched unevenly across the back with orange duct tape. The father bent closer, not yelling, just enough for the boy to hear over the soft thrum of conversations around them. "You see that?" he said, nodding toward the field where Trey was back in drills, already lost in motion. "That's what it looks like when you don't play for the spotlight. Just the team." The boy glanced up, eyes still wide. "He didn't even wave." "He doesn't need to," the father smiled. "You don't have to be flashy to matter. You just have to show up for others." That line hung there, more than advice, something closer to inheritance. The boy nodded slowly, then pulled his hood tighter, like he was storing that thought somewhere warm. They sat back down, but the father's eyes didn't leave the field. His mind wandered, not just to Trey, but to the men he'd known growing up. His own father, who never missed a night shift even when he limped. His best friend's older brother, who enlisted right out of high school and came back quieter, but kinder. Trey reminded him of those men. In the space of that moment, a new kind of silence passed between father and son. Not awkward, not empty, just full of something unspoken. Respect, maybe, or understanding, or both. 2 rows ahead, a woman wiped her eyes. She hadn't been listening, but something about the scene, their posture, the stillness, moved her. Across the stadium, JD Vance stood again, not clapping this time, just watching. He noticed moments like this. They were rare, they were real, and they reminded him why he spoke up in the first place. Not for the headlines, not even for Trey, but for the people who saw themselves in him, the ones who never asked for recognition but changed the world anyway. One locker room, one lesson, one son at a time. By the time the scrimmage ended, the crowd had thinned. Fathers carried sleeping toddlers. Teens raced each other to the parking lot. But that father and son in Row D sat a little longer, like they were waiting for something more. The boy finally spoke. "Dad? Yeah? I think I want to play defense." The father chuckled, not laughing at him, but with pride. He ruffled the boy's hood gently. "Good," he said. "That's where the real work happens." From across the field, Trey jogged off without looking up. But if he had, he might have smiled. Because somewhere in the stands, without knowing it, he had passed the torch. 2 days after the game, JD Vance sat alone in his office. The sunlight filtered through the half-closed blinds, throwing stripes across his desk like faded yard lines. The crowd was gone. The speeches were done. The news had moved on. But the mail hadn't stopped. Stacks of envelopes filled a bin in the corner. Most were from people he'd never met. Teachers, veterans, bus drivers, high schoolers. JD didn't have time to read every letter, but this one was different. It was handwritten, not typed. No return address. The ink smudged slightly like someone had pressed down too hard. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was crooked, the spelling imperfect, but the message clear. Dear Mr. Vance, my name is Jonah. I'm the boy Trey came to see in the hospital. You probably don't remember me, but I saw you on TV talking about him. My mom cried. I watched it twice. I just wanted to say thank you, not just for helping him get his contract, but for telling the world what kind of man he is. I want to be like him too. I'm starting football next spring. Sincerely, Jonah DJD read the letter again, slower this time. Then he leaned back, his eyes glinting with something between peace and ache. He reached into the drawer where he kept the very first letter he'd saved from home, his mama's note, folded and soft from years of being carried around. He placed Jonah's beside it. Different senders, same weight. He didn't need to write back. Some messages deserve silence. As the screen fades to black, JD's voice lingers in a closing voiceover. In a world that rewards noise, we remembered a man who made silence feel like strength. And in a quiet office in DC, one man sat still, not as a politician, but simply as a witness, to a story bigger than politics, a story that began with a name most had never heard and ended with a legacy everyone could carry. This story reminds us that real influence doesn't always wear a spotlight. J.D. Vance's defense of Trey Hendrickson wasn't about sports. It was about character, loyalty, and the kind of quiet strength that holds communities together. In a world obsessed with flashy victories and loud headlines, J.D. chose to champion the people who show up when no one's watching. It's a powerful message. Integrity isn't measured in applause, but in the lives we quietly uplift. Whether you're a senator, a teacher, or a janitor, showing up for others, consistently, humbly, can be revolutionary. And it makes us wonder, who in your life shows up without needing credit? And how often do we tell them it matters? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.